Everyone. My name is Ginger Ward, and I'm the CEO of Southwest Human Development. And for those of you who are not from Southwest Human Development in the room, because I see a lot of familiar faces, we have been in business for over 37 years, working to strengthen the foundation to have every child in Arizona have a great start in life. We provide services to 135,000 children through our 900 team members in the areas of child development, mental health, child welfare, early communication, literacy, and we do a lot of professional development, as well as run many child development programs and disability services. We are lucky to and very fortunate to be funded by First Things First for a number of these programs, and one of them I'm going to tell you about today is Smart Support. So through the generous support of First Things First, we have been able to develop a statewide system for mental health consultation across Arizona, which actually has significantly grown over the last 9 to 10 years, and we are very, very proud of being able to offer the service across the state and in most of the First Things First regions. In the past year alone, we provided support to over 450 providers, and we are happy to be able to tell you that this year we have been expanded into home visiting programs as well as family, friend, and neighbor programs. So we are going to be able to reach about 50 teams of home visiting, 15 home visiting teams across the state who serve over thousands of families in the state of Arizona this year. We are very, very excited to be able to offer the home visitors the support that they need to work with the families and children in all of these different various home visiting programs. So our work in mental health consultation and our belief that all caregivers need the support and help that they can get to have kids have a great start in life and support them in their various pathways is one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be able to introduce our speaker this morning. Dr. Walter Gilliam is a professor of child psychiatry and psychology at the Yale University Child Study Center, as well as the director of the Edward Zigler Center in Child Development and Social Policy. His writing includes the award-winning book, A Vision for Universal Preschool Education, which addresses early childhood care and education programs, school readiness, and the developmental assessment of young children. He is a much sought-after expert by both the media and state and federal decision makers in the U.S. and other countries, and they frequently call on him to provide testimony and briefings on early care and education issues. Today, he's going to share with us his latest findings on expulsion and suspension practices in early childhood settings. He'll talk about how children of color are disproportionately affected by those practices and why. We'll learn new information on how early educators understand implicit bias, and most importantly, how we can further avoid excluding children from early education opportunities. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Walter Gilliam.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here in Phoenix. I toyed with the idea after Ginger so kindly introduced me of me coming out talking from behind because I saw Rian Alvin do it earlier, and I thought if Rian can do that, I'm going to give that a shot, but I chickened out at the last second. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for coming to a session on topics like expulsion and bias and all kinds of words that are sometimes hard for us to want to pair with babies and children and families and doing better for our children. So thank you for braving it to be here. I'm going to start out by saying that this is a topic that I do talk about a fair amount because I've been doing a lot of work in the past maybe 15 years or so on children being kicked out of preschool programs. If we should care enough about getting our children into high-quality early care and education programs, then we should also make sure that we also care equally that they don't get those opportunities later denied to them by being kicked out of these programs. But in a way, it's really not about expulsion at all. In a way, by studying preschool expulsion or suspension or any other kind of term that we can give for exclusionary disciplines like that, we're really just studying canaries in a coal mine. I learned a long time ago that when I go to decision makers, whether they're state decision makers, federal decision makers, and talk to them about the importance of things like early childhood mental health consultation and supports, meaningful supports for providers and for families in order for children to be able to reap the benefits of early care and education, that oftentimes it falls on deaf ears because they don't understand, well, why is this necessary? And so I go to them trying to explain, the importance of things like early childhood mental health supports and things, and they can't quite get it, and they don't really seem to sometimes understand what it is that you're trying to sell them until you've sold them on the problem. Until somebody has purchased your problem, they're not in the market to purchase your solution. And so to some degree, children being expelled from preschool programs and childcare programs is a bit like canaries in the coal mine. The coal operator oftentimes doesn't care much about the quality of the air in the coal mine until they've seen enough dead canaries. Preschool expulsion is not actually the main topic. Preschool expulsion is just the worst possible symptom of something that we're talking about that's a much more important underlying issue, which is how we think about how we treat and how we program for and support all the children that come into our programs. I'm going to start off by showing you a video that some of you may have seen before. Have you seen this video before? Just a few of you. For those of you who have seen it before, I apologize for showing it again. For those of you who haven't, this is a little girl. Her name is Jaisha. She's 5 years old in the video. This happened in 2005. It happened actually just a couple of months before we first released our findings on the rate at which children were being expelled from preschool programs across the nation. This happened fairly close to then. It was in St. Petersburg, Florida. 5-year-old Jaisha, she came to school in kindergarten one day, and she was having a rough day. And this is how her day in kindergarten ended for her.
You need to calm down. You need to do it now. Okay? You remember me?
No, right?
I'm the one you told your mom put handcuffs on you. Who's 34 officers? Hold her hands together.
Stop. Go ahead. Don't worry.
Now, most times that children are expelled from preschool programs, childcare programs, kindergarten programs, it doesn't happen like that. It doesn't usually go down that way. But it can. Sometimes it does. There's been children being escorted out of preschool classrooms by police officers. This happens to be in kindergarten. We first heard about this story right after it came out. I was contacted by the St. Petersburg Times, and they wanted to contact me and get a quote for a story that they were doing on it. And they said, as an expert in child development, is it a good idea to arrest kindergartners? Which is okay that they ask that question, because I can't give you a hell no answer if you don't ask me a hell no question, and so it was kind of good that they did ask me that, but what was also good about this was that how often, raise your hand if you've ever had an investigative journalist at your disposal. I thought that this is great. I've got an investigative journalist at my disposal right now. So instead of me just answering her questions, how about if I say this? I watched the video of what was happening in the classroom, and they said they were going to contact the campus security, but they didn't contact campus security. They contacted the St. Petersburg Police Department. Why? Or I know that this was in an elementary school, not a child care program, not a small child care program that may or may not have adequate resources. This was an elementary school that had a school psychologist, a guidance counselor, a social worker, a school nurse. Why not contact any of those people? Why the St. Petersburg Police Department? So I gave the reporter some of my questions, So instead of just answering her questions, I thought, this is great. I can give her some questions, and maybe she'll go and find them out. Because it's a fascinating thing, because oftentimes we don't have the supports readily available to help our child care providers and teachers succeed on behalf of the children and families they serve. But sometimes, even when we do have them available, people don't use them. Why is that? And it made me ponder bigger kind of questions like that. You know, why is it that in some cases when we do have services available, somebody doesn't think to use the supports? And in this case, they didn't think to use the supports. Instead, they thought to use the St. Petersburg Police Department. Why not the school psychologist or the guidance counselor or the school nurse or somebody maybe from the special ed department, not that she has special needs, but somebody who might specialize in challenging behavior. Why not just, if you don't know who else to call, why not just close your eyes, wander in the hallway and grab that adult? Why not anybody other than the St. Petersburg Police Department? And then that raised another question for me too, which is, why is it that sometimes it seems like we can see challenging behavior out of a child and we can think, that child needs supports. That child needs some assistance. We need to mobilize some assistance, some supports, maybe contact their family, get the family involved. And some of the times we can see pretty much the exact same behavior out of a different child and think, that child needs to be contained. That child needs to be removed away from the rest of these good kids. And in some cases, this is pretty similar kinds of behaviors, but we go different directions with it sometimes. And why is that? Because a lot of the questions involved in, like what kind of supports do we need to make available? How do we get the parents involved? Or even the question of what kind of form do I have to fill out to get this child expelled from my classroom? Those kind of questions are what people where I grew up in Kentucky would call sit-down questions. A question you got to sit down and think through. But I guess there's probably a question that happens before the sit-down questions. And it's probably not a question that's a sit-down question at all. It's that kind of question. It's just split. It's split second. When I see this child's behavior, do I think I need to provide supports? Or do I think I need to get this child out of here? And once that decision is made, all the other decisions after it are sit-down decisions. But that first decision, that's probably not sit-down at all. It's probably just split second. We make it really quickly. And it makes me wonder, on the basis of what do we make those kind of decisions? So within the context of this, when this first came out, we were releasing these findings on children being expelled from preschool programs. Children expelled from state-funded preschool programs for children 3 and 4 years old, mostly in state departments of education, but sometimes not and contracted in, were being expelled at a rate more than 3 times that of grades K through 12 combined. And when you look at child care programs, at a rate about 13 times that of grades K through 12 combined. That's a lot of little children being expelled, isn't it? 13 times? And in this case, we were talking about children being expelled, kicked out for good, kicked out totally. And I guess we can call it a lot of different types of things. We started calling it preschool expulsion. And when you at least to define the instance of kicking a child out permanently be an expulsion. And so when I first started reporting on these kind of findings back in 2005, I gave a talk to a group of early childhood educators and providers. And one of them, after I was talking about preschool expulsion, she raised her hand and she said, I don't like it when you call it expulsion. And I thought to myself, well, I don't like it when you do it. But I didn't say that. Because not everything you think you should say or tweet. So instead what I did was I said, so what do you like to call it? And she said, well, we call it not yet ready for school readiness. Oh, okay, well, I could see how you could market that. And then anybody else have something that they like to call it, I asked. And then somebody else said, well, we call it, we're not the right place for your child. And okay, well, anybody else? And then somebody else had what remains to this day my all-time favorite branding of preschool expulsion. She said, we call it giving the child the gift of time. Doesn't that sound nice? Like, honestly, if that's how you're going to market it, I could use some preschool expulsion in my life. Bring on some preschool expulsion. You know, we could call it all kinds of different things, but if you tell a child that they can't be in the program anymore, that's expulsion. And if you tell a child that they can't be there for a certain period of time, that's suspension. And then there's, because this is early care and education, we have another category that we can sometimes do that the K through 12 school doesn't really seem to have, which is we could say things like he's having a hard day, you got to pick him up early. And that's at 1 o'clock. And then the next day, he's having a hard day again, you're going to have to come pick him up, and that's 12:30. He's having a hard day, now it's 12. And then eventually the parents realize they don't want my child there, and they don't know what to do. And the parents maybe have to go to work and realize this is no longer viable childcare. And so then they remove the child. And so I guess that's not really expulsion because they voluntarily removed the child, except it kind of is. You know, and what do we call that? You know, and some of us call these things soft expulsions, these kind of expulsions that aren't really expulsions, but they kind of are. You know, and they send a strong message to parents. And all of this is basically just because in many cases we don't know what else to do. Because we don't have the supports in place. Because we haven't planned for the children to be in our programs and realize that in some cases children come into our programs with a lot of concerns. And that's what we signed up for. That's what we signed up for when we said that this is a program designed to help children be able to succeed in life. We signed up for children coming to us who may not already be ready. You know, that's what we signed up for, you know, and when we don't plan for that, then ultimately it's easy for early care and education to cease and no longer be an opportunity for children to succeed and just another opportunity for children to experience failure earlier. You know, and that's what's at stake with this kind of stuff. So anyway, that's what we learned with the expulsion rates. Just a lot of different ways you can graph this stuff. Like here's a way to graph it. Here's the preschool expulsion rate for state-funded pre-K programs. This is what happens in K through 12 in terms of expulsion rates. And what would you say is the adult equivalent of being expelled? What? I think a good case can be made for incarceration. Because when you think about it, jail isn't just a place. Jail is also the absence of place. Jail means not here with us, which is what expulsion means. Expulsion means not here with, I don't know where you're going to be, but you ain't here with us. And to a degree, that's what incarceration is too. So what is the adult incarceration rate in the United States in terms of numbers of incarcerations per 1,000 adults? It's about the same as the preschool expulsion rate. And when you look at the racial disparity, it's almost identical. When you look at the gender disparity, it's almost identical. When you look at the zip codes, which feed one or the other, almost identical. And I'm not saying that that proves that there's a preschool to prison pipeline, but I am saying this. If there is a preschool to prison pipeline, it's amazing how straight the pipe is and how consistent the diameter is all the way through from early childhood. We know what our needs are going to be later on simply because we're the ones who are serving children before they become the adults, that we treat in very similar ways sometimes to the way in which we treated them when they were small children. So I don't want to say, you know, that this is the only kind of data. We came up with this study back in 2005, but there were other people too that were doing smaller scale studies at the same time. I'm going to draw your attention to this one right here. In Illinois, 42% of the centers in the state of Illinois reporting expelling at least one child in the past 12 months. But what's unique about that study is this. They were only looking at infant toddler child care centers. Babies. 42% of the infant toddler child care centers in Illinois reported expelling at least one baby or toddler in the past 12 months. What do you think was the number one reason why an infant or a toddler might be expelled? Bite. See, when I told you the stat, you gasped, but then when I asked you why, you knew. You know, biting, you know. But it can be all other kinds of things too. There was one child in a study that got expelled because her brother was a biter. And the program had a policy that they accepted children as family units, and so they expelled as a family unit too. Lots of different ways to sort of think about predictors for the likelihood of a child being expelled from preschool programs. Here's some of the strongest predictors of the likelihood that a program is going to expel a child in the preschool years. Child-teacher ratios. As the number of children per adult increases, the likelihood that a child's going to be expelled increases. Does that surprise anybody? How about this one? Program length a day. Half-day, school day, extended day programs that are open 8, 9, 10 hours a day. The more than hours the program is open per day, the greater the likelihood somebody's going to get expelled. Does that surprise you? Job stress. Low levels of job stress, average levels of teacher job stress, high levels of job stress. The more job stress that the teacher feels, the greater the likelihood she may expel one of her stressors. And teachers who screen positive for depression expel at about twice the rate of teachers who screen negative for depression. Does that surprise you? And how about this one? Access to behavioral supports. The more access that a teacher reports, no access, on-call access, meaning that the person isn't here, but if I ask for somebody, they might come, versus on-site access, meaning the person's actually employed in my program, or that they're making regular visits whether I ask them to come by or not. The more access the teacher has to some kind of support, the less likely that that teacher will feel the need to resort to the decision to expel a child. Does that surprise you either? I would guess that a lot of this doesn't surprise anybody. Maybe none of this surprises you. But when you think about it, because these are the best predictors that we have of an expulsion happening. What do all of these best predictors of expulsion have in common? They're not about the child. None of them. They're about the program. They're about the adults. They're about the decisions that we make. Those are some of the best predictors of whether a program is going to be expelling a child or not. It's not about the child in many cases. It's about the decisions that we make in terms of resources allocations and the stress that we place upon teachers and whether or not we have opportunities to mitigate that stress. And so when you think about it, preschool expulsion is really not a child behavior. It's an adult decision that we might make in little ways regarding how we view that child's behavior, or that we might make in big ways regarding how we allocate resources and how we allocate supports to the providers who care for our children. So who is it that's more likely to get expelled? Well, we know this from some of the studies that we had done before. In mixed age groups, where we have 3 and 4-year-old children together in the same group, the 4-year-old child is more likely to be expelled than the 3-year-old child. That was an interesting finding for us. We didn't really have a hypothesis going into this, whether or not 3-year-olds would be more likely than 4-year-olds, or 4-year-olds would be more likely. I could have spun an argument, I guess, for 3-year-olds. I could have spun an argument for 4-year-olds. So we didn't really know what to make out of the findings, so we pulled together focus groups of teachers similar to the ones in the national study that gave us this finding. And we asked these preschool teachers, we said, in a national study of preschool teachers similar to you, this is what the teachers told us. Why do you think they would say that? And the teachers thought about it, and they discussed among themselves, and they came back with a potential reason. And this is what the teachers said. The teachers said, well, it's one thing if a child's aggressive. And we didn't say anything about aggressive. But when they thought about expulsion, they thought aggression. It's one thing if a child is aggressive and the child's this big, but it's different if a child's aggressive and he's this big. And so we asked the obvious question, so how does height factor into your expulsion decisions? And they said, well, if a child is smaller, then the child's probably the same size or smaller than everyone else in the classroom. But if the child's bigger, then there's a good chance that the child might be bigger than some of the other children in the classroom. And then maybe someone will get hurt. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I can understand that. I was a classroom teacher. That's how I started out my career. And we like to think that we care about each and every child in the classroom, and we do, but we also have to balance a lot of needs. And we have to be concerned about this child, but also concerned about the well-being of all the other children. I can fully get that. I really can. But if you listen to what the teachers are saying really carefully, what they're saying is this. It's not what the child's doing. Because the 3-year-old could be just as aggressive as the 4-year-old. It's not about what they're doing. It's not about the child's behavior at all. It's about what I imagine could happen as a result of it. That's what it's about. And once we started understanding that better, that it's not really just the child's behavior, but what we imagine could happen as a result of it, that opened up a whole host of ways to think about this, because it's not just about the child, it's also about our imagination and what we think and all the things that can get burdened on top of that imagination as we make decisions about what a child may or may not be capable of doing, what a child may or may not actually do in a classroom. Black children expelled at a rate more than twice that of white children. Boys expelled at about 4 times the rate of girls in state-funded pre-K programs. And so when you put it all together, there's really 3 B's of preschool expulsion risk: big, black, and boy. And the more of those that existed within a single child, the greater the likelihood of an expulsion. However, bear in mind, that's in the national data. And your mileage may vary based on local driving conditions. And so how that factors into understanding Arizona may be very different. Maybe, because when you think about it, disproportionality can be broken down across a lot of different lines, and it may not just necessarily be about race, it could be about all kinds of other factors. Perception of wealth, perception of who's your parents, perceptions and guesses about what kind of family I think that family is, newcomer status versus old established family in Phoenix, speak the predominant language or just learning the predominant language of a community, Native American status, Latina status, all kinds of different ways that we can break people down. In the national study, this is what we had found. If we were to replicate something like this specific to Arizona, it could look a little different here. So when we first came out with the findings, the U.S. Department of Education started collecting data eventually on the rate at which children were being expelled from preschool programs, largely found the same thing that we had found, except that they had found even greater levels of racial diversity than what we had found. And so it raised this question of, is it possible that biases may at least partially impact the way in which we think about children, which could potentially lead to disproportionality in gender and in race in terms of who's likely to be expelled. And again, every time that I talk about race, please think about race in a big, broad sense. We happen to be, in many of our studies, looking at the black-white divide, but that could be very, very different in different states. And so we started looking at the research. This is some of the stuff that we had found. There's a man named Russell Skibb at Indiana University who does research on gender disproportionality and racial disproportionality of expulsion and suspension practices in K through 12. He doesn't do early childhood. But in this one study, he had these lists of this elementary school records of children who had been suspended and expelled from school. And he had on the records, he knew the child's age and grade level and gender and race, and knew also what was it that the child did? What did the child do wrong? This was all written, out and had like a narrative of what did the child actually do that got the child in trouble. And then there was another variable of what happened to the child as a result. Did the child get sent to the principal's office? Did the child get suspended? If suspended, in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, did the child get expelled? And what Russell Skibb did was he blacked over all the data, covered it up, you couldn't read it, except for just the variable of what did the child do? And then had other elementary school teachers from different schools rate on a scale, how severe is that? How bad would that be if that were to happen? Took those ratings, put it into the data set, unmasked the rest of the data, and then analyzed the results and found that even when the severity of the behavioral problems are identical, the black child as opposed to the white child more likely to get sent to the principal's office, more likely to get suspended, if suspended, more likely to be suspended out of school, more likely to be expelled, even when the behavior problems are the same. Now, there was another man that came along, Philip Goff. He does research mostly having to do with things like biases that police officers might have in shoot, no shoot drills and things like that. And so he did this one study that was a little bit different than that, and this one had to do with children. And so in this study, what he did was he he had these vignettes, these stories about a child who may or may not have done the bad deed, may or may not have lost the ball, may or may not have broken the vase, may or may not have done, whatever. And you read it and you don't know if, maybe he did it, maybe she did that thing, I don't know, I can't tell. Then at the end of the story, you have to rate how guilty you think the child is. It's kind of a hard call in most of the cases. But unbeknownst to the people who were in the study, they paired different pictures of different children with stories. And so you might get story A, and you might get a picture of a black boy, or you might get a picture of a white girl or a brown boy. And then they compared to see, what is the impact of the face that gets paired with it? Because the story is the same. Everybody gets the exact same stories. And all the pictures were children of the ages between 10 and 17 years old. And so they gave this study, and then they analyzed the results, and they found out that whenever a picture of a child of color, especially a black boy, but anytime a picture of a child of color was paired with a story, the guilty ratings went up, even when all the details are the same, identical. Just knowing that child, just seeing that face of color just makes it seem just perhaps more likely that the child actually did the bad thing. I don't think anybody thought about it. I don't think they sat down and considered it. My guess is it happened just like that. They just saw the face, and then it made them feel a certain way, and then the stories took on a completely different complexion to them once they felt that certain way. And so that's what Philip Goff had found. Oh, and at the end of it, just for interest, he asked people to guess how old the children were in the pictures. And again, the pictures were all children between the ages of 10 and 17 years old. But anytime somebody saw a picture of a child of color, they tended to overestimate the age of the child by about 4.5 years. And when you're 10 to 17 years old, 4.5 years is a long time. And we already talked earlier about when you look a little bit bigger, you just look a little scarier, maybe. Like you might hurt somebody. That's what he had found. Less likely to feel pain. This was an interesting one. So in this study, the participants were actually children, preschoolers in some cases, 4 or 5 years old, 7 years old, 9 or 10 years old. Those were the ages of the children, 3 different groups. Brought them into a laboratory and taught them how to rate pain, how to rate how much something were to hurt. And if this were to happen to you, how much would it hurt on a pain scale? And so after they taught them how to reliably rate pain, they then, had them think about certain things. Pretend you stubbed your toe. How much would it hurt? You bit your tongue. How much would it hurt? You hit your head. How much would it hurt? And then they showed them pictures of children, some black, brown, white, boys, girls. And they showed them a picture of a child, maybe a brown girl, maybe a black boy, and said, he bit his tongue. How much did it hurt? And the child would rate it. And then they showed them another picture of a different child. He bit his tongue, or she bit her tongue. How much did it hurt? And they went through a whole series of pictures and a whole series of different kinds of scenarios. And when they analyzed it, they didn't find anything at 5 years old. But by the time the children were 7 years old, any time that a child saw a picture of a child of color, especially a black boy, they assumed that child would feel less pain than any other child experiencing the same thing, and less pain than they themselves would have felt had it happened to them. And by the time the children were 10 years old, it was a very strong finding. And when you think about it, it's really not a study about pain at all, is it? Because nobody gets hurt in the study. It's about something else. It's about our ability to imagine someone else's pain. And there's a word for that. It's empathy. And what they were finding was that by the time when the children were 5 years old, but by the time they were 7 years old, they seemed to be more judicious or discriminating in terms of who is worthy of my empathy versus with whom I'll withhold my empathy. There's a lot of things that we don't know about our early childhood workforce, things that we need to learn about them in order to be able to be better supportive to our early childhood workforce. But there's one thing that I know for a fact. I absolutely know this for a fact. every single preschool and child care provider in the United States, every one of them, is older than 7 years old. And if we can have this in us by the time we're 7, imagine how much more you can pick up and become a part of you before we ever let you loose on children. It's just a fascinating thing to think about. Shifting standards is a little harder for me to explain, but I can pantomime it. But if I pantomime it, you have to play along. So you all can play along, right? You're early childhood people, right? You can do this, right? You can play along. Okay, so this is a softball game, coeducational softball game. And your role is you are the audience. You're in the stands at a coeducational softball game. Ready? Got it? So up to bat first, da-da-da-da-da-da, is the boy. And the boy's here, and he's ready, and he's got his bat, and the pitch comes in, and he gets a standard base hit, goes right over there, runs to first base, easily safe, and everybody politely applauds, right? Very good. Okay, then up to bat comes next, the girl. Here comes a girl. And then the pitch comes in, and she gets a standard base hit too, about the same place, runs to first base, easily home, and everybody just jumps up out of the stands in a roaring ovation. Oh. And there's tears just rolling down your face. And there's music that swells up out of the bleachers. And we don't know where the music came from, but it's there. And it may feel like we're being kind to the girl, and maybe that's our intent. But we're also showing something else. We're showing that we have an underlying stereotype bias, that the boy did what the boy is supposed to do. But the girl, she violated our stereotype bias. She did something we didn't expect a girl would do. In this case, violated it in a positive way, and so, we give her positive appraisal back. What shifting standards tells us is this. Shifting standards says that we shift our standards when we're making appraisals for people, especially appraisals that could be things that are easily given, like letter grades, attaboys, attagirls, applause, smiles, all those things that can be freely given away. We tend to shift our standards on the basis of what we expect from the person that we're appraising, not just some universal standard that cuts across. And it may not have mattered that boy, this was the first time he's ever played softball or baseball in his life. And the girl, well, she transferred in from a different high school. And on that different high school, she was the captain of the state softball championship team. And you might not know that. And what shifting standards teaches us is this. You'll still make your assessments on the basis of what you imagine can happen. And if we understand a child and a family really well, there might be circumstances where it makes sense to shift our standards on the basis of what we know that this child can do a little bit more. We know that this child needs a little extra encouragement. But what shifting standards teaches us is this too. Even if we don't know the family, we don't know the child well at all, we'll still make appraisals. And we'll still make those appraisals on the basis of some kind of expectation that we have for that family. And we'll base that expectation on something that's readily and easily observable, even if we don't know them. We'll look at that and say, well, he should be able to hit that ball. Or, ooh, I wonder if we got 2 outs. Here comes the girl up to bat. That's the way shifting standards works. There was a study, shifting standards, shifting topics for a little bit. There was a study that came out that was a study of middle school English teachers, and they were all asked to put a letter grade on an essay. And they were told that this is an essay. They were all white middle school English teachers. And they were told that this is a study to see what do middle school English teachers find important when they're deciding what kind of letter grade to put an A or a B or a C or a D on a paper. And so I want you to read this essay. Now, they weren't told that these were all poorly written essays. Every teacher gets the same essay, and it was written to look like C plus D minus kind of work, like not a good essay. And they were told, take this red ink pen and find all the errors, and then put the letter grade up at the top, and then we're going to look and see what things factor into your letter grade decision. And that's what they were told. What they weren't told was the part where, 1, everybody gets the same essay, And because of that, we kind of know where all the errors are. But everybody's getting a poorly written essay. But there will be one difference, and that's at the top, there's going to be a name right next to where we're going to ask you to put the grade. And that name is either going to apply a white non-Latina, a Latino, or an African-American student. That name will imply one of those racial groups. And so what we're interested in is not, what kind of letter grade you put in there and what kind of errors you find, because we kind of know where all the errors are. What we're really interested in is when you see that name, who gets the highest grade? Who gets the lower grades? Now remember, those were the three groups. We had white, non-Latina, we had Latino, and then we had African American. Now, those were the groups. Who do you think of those three groups got the best grade? White? I'm hearing a lot of white. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I will tell you this. Who actually got the highest grade, by a long shot, were the Latina and the African American children. Interesting, isn't it? And the reason why is because you've already forgotten about shifting standards. Because this was the poorly written essay. These essays were written to look bad. And it was almost as if when they read it and they saw that Latina name or that African American name, they thought, well, this doesn't look all that bad for a black kid. This doesn't look all that bad for a Latina. Or they might have looked and thought, well, I would have thought Emily would have written a better essay. Because the bias can work that way too, and children pick up on it. Don't think about bias as only being about some kind of desire to hurt someone. It can be in a lot of different ways because it basically has to do with the expectations that we place on them and the way in which our appraisals on an everyday basis can be related to those kind of things. When I talk about implicit bias, some of the times I try to find ways to make it make sense to people. Here's one way that you might want to think about it. I'm going to tell you a riddle. So in this riddle, and if you've heard it before, please try not to blurt the answer out really loudly. Just smirk. That smirk that you know something that others don't yet know. So here's the riddle. There's two men driving down the road in a car, and then they get in a terrible accident. It's a father and a son in the car driving down the road, terrible accident, and unfortunately, the father dies immediately on the scene, and the son is in critical condition. And they have to life squad the son out. And then they life squad the son to the hospital. They need life-saving surgery. And so the nurses are getting the son ready. The father's gone off someplace else because he's deceased. And they're scrubbing in and they're getting the patient ready. And they call in the best doctor at the hospital, the best surgeon at the hospital. And the best surgeon at the hospital gets there, rushes there and everything. And the best surgeon is scrubbing in and getting ready. And then the surgeon comes out and looks down at the patient, looks up at the nurses and says, "I can't do this surgery. That's my son." And then you wonder, well, how can that be? Because the father just died, And I've given this riddle to groups before, and I've heard people say, well, maybe he has two dads because they're gay, and that's possible. And I've heard some say, well, maybe he's adoptive, and your biological dad and the adopted dad. And I heard one person come up with, well, maybe he's Catholic, and the man in the car was his priest. Well, maybe. And it's interesting how hard it is sometimes to come up with what I would imagine would be the simplest solution, which is that the surgeon is his mother. But to many people, it's just hard to imagine that the best surgeon would be a woman. It's just not the image that pops into a lot of people's minds. I gave this riddle once when I was giving a talk on implicit bias to a group of medical students at Boston University. And there was this one woman in front of me who was either a medical school student or a resident who was just flabbergasted at the answer, that it was his mother, because it never occurred to her, never occurred to her that the best surgeon at the hospital could be a woman. It's just kind of hard to imagine. Sometimes biases are the things that we assume about somebody that they might not necessarily deserve as that assumption. And sometimes biases are the things that we fail to assume about somebody, even though they might equally deserve the possibility of that assumption. And that's one way to sort of think about these implicit biases. If this were the image that we had in the United States, or the predominant image of what a surgeon looks like, that riddle would make no sense. I'd have to change that riddle. If this is the image you had of what a surgeon looks like, I'd have to change the riddle to be something like, two women are driving a car down the road, a mother and a daughter. That's how I'd have to tell the riddle before it would make any sense at all. But that's not the image that we typically have. Do you remember when this movie came out? Not too long ago, bless you. My daughter was about 17, 18 years old at the time. My wife, daughter, and I went to the movies to go watch Wonder Woman. And we're watching the movie, and my daughter, who was about 17, 18 at the time, she's sitting there, and she's got this huge smile on her face. Just amazing to watch, you know. And as her father, I'm sitting there and just, you know, she's like an 18-year-old woman, and she's watching this and just really enjoying it. And I look over at my wife, and she's sitting next to my daughter, and during all the action scenes, my wife is over there, she's doing this. She's going. She's just like fighting along with Wonder Woman, you know, and it was fascinating for me to see this, you know. And it was fascinating for me to see this in large part because I was getting a chance to see how they experienced something that every little white boy in the 1970s like me got a steady dose of every single Saturday morning. If you were a white boy in the 70s like me, you could turn on your television set and very reliably every Saturday morning get as big of a dose as you'd like of seeing people who look just like who I know I'm going to turn out to be when I'm a man, being all the superheroes, saving the day, righting all the wrongs, fighting all the bad guys who look like somebody I don't think I'm going to grow up to be. That was my childhood. But it wasn't my daughter's really, and it certainly wasn't my wife. But for one little moment, it kind of was. Do you think it's important for our girls to get images of strong women in their lives? Do you think it's important for our boys to see images of strong women in their lives? And if you felt that way about Wonder Woman, how did you feel when this movie came out? And did you feel equally that way? Or any other representation and ways in which we can represent groups that we care for in our families, in our programs, you know, any kind of other representation that shows them in strong, powerful positions instead of the at-risk position, or the bad person position, or the person who needs to be vanquished so that somebody who looks like me can save the day. You know, it's a fascinating thing, I think, for all of us to think about. We were interested in studying how some of this stuff might look in terms of implicit biases in child care programs and preschool programs. And so we embarked on what we thought might be the first study of implicit bias in early care and education programs. This is back in 2015. It's not an easy sell to convince a funder to fund a study of implicit bias in preschool, at least not back then, you know. And so, you know, we were very grateful that the W.K. Kellogg funded this study. And so please do me a favor and eat lots of cereal. Just, if you see a box of cereal, just buy it. And it makes a great gift. It comes in its own box. It's ready for giving. We collected the data at a national conference. We don't say exactly where we collected the data, but we set up in an exhibitor's hall at a national conference that's regularly attended between 7,000 and 8,000 preschool and child care providers across the United States. That's where we went. And so if you don't guess, shh. And so we went to the conference, and then we set up in the exhibitor's hall, and then as preschool teachers and child care providers came by, we recruited them into the study to participate. How many people have heard about this study that came out a while back? So some of you have and some of you haven't. We had two parts of the study, and in the first part of the study, we had the teachers watch a video. And then in the video, we had a group of children, and they were in a preschool classroom, and then they were like doing normal preschool interactions. And this is what we told the teachers. They had headphones on. And we told the teachers, this is a study to see how quickly preschool teachers and childcare providers like you can find evidence of challenging behaviors before they become too problematic in the classroom. That the trick to managing a child's challenging behaviors is seeing when something bad could happen so that you can intervene quickly. So we're going to fit you up with an eye tracker that can track down to the pixel and down to 1,000th of a second where you're looking on this screen. And I want you to hit this button anytime that you see something that could turn into a challenging behavior if the teacher doesn't intervene quick enough. Make sense? So that's what we told them. The parts that we didn't tell them were this. It's going to be 6 minutes of video shot from a variety of different directions. No child is going to misbehave in any of these videos. And the reason that I know that is because all of these children are child actors that I've hired and put at a table and asked to quietly play with Play-Doh. And so if you notice, there's a gender balance and a racial balance. So the question really isn't, this is the part we also didn't tell them, the question really isn't, can you find the evidence of challenging behavior? Because there aren't any to find. The question is this: when I lead you to believe that somebody's going to misbehave in the classroom, who do you look at? Who do you look at first? Who do you look at the most? Who do you go back to in case you might have missed something? In other words, if you weren't a preschool teacher, but instead you were a mall cop, who would you be following at the Gap right now? That's what we were interested in. Is this making sense? Because if implicit biases are the subconscious biases that we all have, but we don't know we have them, you can't like take a microphone and go up to somebody and say, you know, subconscious biases are the biases we have, but we don't know we have them. Do you have them? You know, you can't do that. You have to find sneaky ways to study it. And so this was our sneaky way. I'm going to show you 15 seconds of what the preschool teachers saw. They saw 6 minutes of this shot from a variety of different angles. Did you see the misbehaviors? Yeah. Did you hear all the background noise in the classroom? Yeah. Interestingly, these were the only 4 children in the classroom. Everybody else in the classroom was either a cameraman or a producer or a member of our team. What we did to make it seem more authentic is we went to Amazon and purchased something called typical preschool noises. And then after we bought typical preschool noises, we layered it into the video just so that it would kind of, so message from that is if you don't have enough typical preschool noises in your life, I suggest you go to Amazon and you can buy some. So that's what the teachers actually saw. After they saw that, we then collected the data. We recreated the study in a preschool program near Yale just to be able to show you what it looked like. You can see in this video, here's a preschool teacher getting ready to do the eye tracker. Here's another teacher. She's looking at a screen. You see the black bar at the bottom of the screen? That's the eye tracker. Shoots a little beam off of your eye. That's what the teacher sees. There's Maria. She's a research assistant. She sees the same video that the teacher sees, but in her video, there's a yellow dot. That yellow dot's where that teacher's looking right now. And so by knowing where the teacher's looking, every single 1,000th of a second, we can then go frame by frame and analyze exactly where the children are and compute the amount of time that a teacher is looking at this child versus that child versus out a window or a doorknob or whatever else. All making sense? There was a second part after this happened. So we collected this data for a while. The screen goes blank. We asked them, please remember the letter of the child you believe required the most of your attention. These are the children who were in the video. We don't tell the teachers this, but we're still tracking their eyes. And we know what letter they look at. We know what letter they look at the most. And then the screen goes blank again. And then we ask them to enter the letter of the child they looked at. Well, now, we don't really need to ask the teachers who did you look at the most, because I know down to 1,000th of a second who you looked at most. What we were curious about is this. We were curious about 3 questions. 1, when I lead you to believe that somebody's going to misbehave in a preschool classroom or child care program, where do your biases take your eyes? And then 2, here, are you aware of it? And then 3, when the screen goes blank again, are you willing to tell me? Because you can't really diffuse a bias bomb if you don't know how it's wired. And I need to know whether it's truly implicit bias. Maybe it's not implicit. Maybe the teachers actually know, in which case it's a completely different thing. So that's what we were doing to try to better understand this. There was a second part of the study. I won't go into a whole lot of details explaining it, but in this second part of the study, we give the teacher a description of a child who's engaging in really significant behavioral problems. And we ask them to rate the severity of that behavioral problem. We alter the name of the child. So every teacher gets the same story, except some teacher gets a story that implies a black boy or a black girl or a white boy or a white girl. And obviously you could recreate a study like this using Latina names, names that people might naturally associate with native cultures, all kinds of different things. So in this case, we were using African American and white, and boys and girls. And then we also further randomized a second part of it, where some people got a second paragraph. And the second paragraph described home conditions and how challenging some of the home life circumstances are in a way that might explain why this child might be acting this way. In a way, basically, we were just giving the teachers ACEs information. You know what I mean by ACEs, right? Adverse childhood experiences. We were telling the teachers about these adverse childhood experiences, wondering if we tell teachers about adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed care, if we provide teachers trauma-informed information, is it possible that empathy comes in to play? And is it possible that that empathy would mitigate racial bias and gender bias, and that there's less room to show bias about a child and family if we humanize them by telling their story, and that biases maybe are the thing that we do when we put people and families into categories and we dehumanize them that way. But maybe the best way to combat that is to rehumanize them by telling the family story, telling this child's story, letting the stressors be known. And so that's what we were kind of curious about. So instead of me telling you the findings, I thought that what I would do is I would let Corey Turner of NPR News Education tell you the findings himself. He did this brief little 2-minute video that describes what it is that we found in the study.
There's a new study out of the Yale Child Study Center that I had to read a few times just to believe what it was telling me. The researchers recruited about 135 preschool teachers. They had them watch video footage of 4 kids playing: a black boy, a black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And they told the teachers, their subjects, watch the video, there may be some challenging behaviors. As soon as you see something that could become challenging, hit the enter key on your keypad. Well, here's the trick. There was no challenging behavior. The researchers were using eye scan technology to see which child the teachers were looking at the most. And what they found is that the teachers, both white and black alike, spent the most time watching the black boy, waiting for bad behavior that never came. There's one more really interesting headline in this study, which comes later. The teachers were also given a 1-paragraph description to read of a hypothetical child with a stereotypical name who behaves pretty badly in class, pushes, scratches, throws toys. And some of the teachers were also given some biographical information that helped make sense of that behavior. They were told that the child lives with his mother, father has been in and out for years, they're relatively poor, the mother is depressed, works 3 jobs. Researchers wanted to know if knowing this information made the teachers more empathetic to the kid. Well, here's the shock. It did, but only if the teacher and the child were of the same race. If the teacher and the child, a white teacher and a black child, or even a black teacher and a white child, knowing that biographical information, those teachers were less empathetic towards those students. And here's why this matters. Imagine if this is true, if there's this empathy deficit in preschool, well, imagine where else that's true.
Did you pick up on some of the main findings there? So in terms of where the biases took their eyes, teachers looked more at black children, especially the black boy. However, when we asked the teachers who they looked at the most, they thought they were looking more at boys. Interestingly, the teachers thought they had a boy bias. Boys misbehave. But in fact, the primary driver of the bias was more racially oriented, with gender layered on top of it. In that second part of the study, what we found was that knowing more biographical information about the family, knowing more about the trauma history of the family actually does cause the teachers to appear to become more empathic to the child, and so their behavior ratings go down in severity. But only if the teacher was of the same race as what the teacher thought the child was. If the teacher was of a different race than she thought the child was, the more background information we gave the teacher, the more severe the behavior problem seemed. It actually made them feel less hopeful that anything could ever possibly improve the situation. It's fascinating, isn't it? We had actually thought going into this that perhaps teachers knowing more about their families might actually be beneficial. I'm not so sure that that's the case anymore. I think it's a little bit more nuanced with that. I think just knowing more information causes people to feel more of how they already felt. And if they already felt connected to that child, knowing more information strengthens that connection, even more empathy. But if they've already otherized this family, the more trauma information I gave them, it seemed like the more hopeless they became. And not only in their mind do those children behave that way, so do their parents. That it actually maybe strengthened whatever underlying biases were there. It's a complicated thing for us because I really was hoping for the simpler answer. But I don't think it's going to be just that. And it makes me kind of worried about what happens when we trauma-inform people that don't have a strong connection in place already to the family that they're serving. Is it possible that when we trauma-inform people about families that they don't really feel connected to already, that trauma information may actually further drive them away? That's the concern that we have right now, and that's some of the stuff that we're starting to look into more. I'm going to switch gears. Oh, I want to tell you this story. So I was giving a talk similar to this in Las Vegas, Nevada, and it was about biases and some of the findings that we had found. And I'm used to giving talks where there's adults in the room, but in this particular case, there was one younger person in the room, and the MC had noticed this younger person. And I'd given my talk, and then a juvenile court judge gave a talk about bias in the court systems, and then we all got our lunch, and we sat down, we were eating lunch, and it was lemon chicken, because at a conference it's always lemon chicken. And so we were eating the lemon chicken at the table, and the MC comes up, and she brings with her this younger girl who was there, and she said, I was surprised to see somebody your age here at the conference. And I was surprised too. It was like 300 or 400 people. I didn't see anybody I thought was younger than about 30. And she brought her up and said, I was a little surprised to see somebody here as young as you. What brought you to the conference today? And she said, well, I came here with my mother. And then the MC said, well, did you hear anything today that stuck with you? And she said, yeah. I remember when that professor guy was talking about how teachers look at kids like me. And I stopped chewing my lemon chicken because I became actually very concerned about, what she might have thought about that, how she might have felt. And I try to remain cognizant of the fact that when I give talks like this, I'm really not talking about how we as a society view children who look like my daughter. We're talking about how society might view children who might look like your daughter or somebody else's daughter, not my daughter. But I didn't really expect that in the audience there might be a child of color herself in the audience. And I actually did become just very worried about, how it might have made her feel. Because I don't want to hurt her. And so the MC asked her another question. She said, the question that actually worried me the most. She said, well, how did that make you feel? And she said something that I will never, ever, ever forget. She said, well, me and my friends, we already knew it. We just didn't think you all did. Isn't that fascinating? And she taught me an awful lot. One of the things that she taught me is to maybe try and get a little backbone and some courage, and maybe also not to worry so much that I'm going to offend, because I'm not going to offend her. She already knows it. I'm not going to tell her anything that's going to surprise her. She already knows it. The thing that she might not know is that somebody else might care enough to want to know. That we might care enough to want to know. That's the thing that would surprise her. But I'm not going to tell anybody of color something they don't know about bias. They've known it longer than I've ever known it, and they'll feel it at a level that I can't study. I can study effects of certain things, and I can try to show with eye tracking technology how this plays out, but I can't feel it, but she can. And she taught me something else too. She taught me this, is that how we treat our children and our families, it's not really just how we intend to treat them, it's more what actually happens in the moment. She can see the effects of our behaviors. But adults, when we think about how we interact with children and our families that we're serving, we tend to report on our behaviors filtered through our best intentions. And she doesn't have that bias of our best intentions. She just sees just what we do. She's perhaps a better reporter. And as a result, it made me think, how can we be collecting information like this better from particularly the children's perspectives? Because they might actually be the best reporters on all of this anyway. I've been interested in early childhood mental health consultation. How many people have heard of that? Early childhood mental health? Yeah, so early childhood supports, mental health supports that come into classrooms in order to support teachers. In part because, being a preschool teacher is a stressful job. In part because some of our children do come to us with challenging behaviors. But also because a consultant is also an objective set of eyes in the classroom. And it's hard to see our biases because that takes a really intense level of self-reflection to see yourself, and especially to see a part of yourself that you might not want to see. Having an objective consultant in the classroom might also be a way for us to be able to think about how we can counteract bias, because it's another way for more objective information to be able to enter into the decisions and the discussions about the interactions between the staff in the classroom and the children. We did a study in Connecticut. It was a statewide random controlled trial where we randomly assigned teachers to either receive a consultant immediately upon request or be placed in a wait list. And then we analyzed the results and found very significant findings in favor of early childhood mental health consultation, and not only in favor of it, but it's way cheaper than anything else you can do. It's a whole lot cheaper than another year in preschool. It's a whole lot cheaper than the difference in cost between preschool and going to a special ed preschool program. It's certainly way cheaper than outpatient psychotherapy. It's about the cheapest thing you can possibly do. And it's effective. And so from that perspective, it certainly seems like us the right thing to do. Again, Corey Turner of NPR Ed did a study on this, or a story on this. He brought reporters from NPR Ed with microphones to follow and shadow an early childhood mental health consultant in Connecticut that was part of the study that we had done in order to be able to describe what early childhood mental health consultation looks like and feels like and sounds like. And this is what he has in his story.
Now to one of the biggest challenges American schools face right now, meeting the mental health needs of students. This morning, we're going to focus on the youngest brains in the system, preschoolers. In 2012, some 6,700 children enrolled in public pre-K around the country were suspended. Experts argue that suspending a 3 or 4-year-old, no matter how bad the behavior, is a bad idea. New research out this week highlights a powerful alternative to simply sending a child home. Corey Turner of the NPR Ed team has the story.
It's playtime for Miss Terry Walker's preschool class. They're bouncing off the walls of a small YMCA gymnasium in a low-income neighborhood of Bridgeport, Connecticut. While most kids play tag, one boy wearing bright orange socks heads straight for a crate in the corner. There, among the balls and cones, he finds a long plastic stick, and he starts swinging it at the nearest child. Miss Terry, as the kids call her, quickly steps in, but listen to how she does it.
It's too high? Okay, let's put it low. All right, there we go. High five.
In many preschools, the words no, stop, and don't get thrown around like glitter. But not in Miss Terry's class. Instead, she turns the boy's stick into a game, a bar that he and soon everybody else wants to jump over.
Oh, yes! You did it!
Social worker Maria Santos, who's been watching and coaching Miss Terry, can barely contain her excitement.
That's like the perfect example of gentle redirection and, telling children what to do instead of what not to do, right? Because that's how they're going to learn that.
Santos is part of a program run out of Connecticut's Department of Children and Families that's meant to help any pre-K teacher or childcare provider in the state who's having trouble with a disruptive child. It's called the Early Childhood Consultation Partnership, or ECCP. And before we get to how it works, it appears that it does work.
The children who got the intervention had a significant decrease in the types of challenging behaviors that are likely to lead to a classroom expulsion or suspension.
That's Walter Gilliam at Yale. He and his research team have studied the program for years and just published their latest findings. While it's tough to know if ECCP has long-term benefits, the short-term results, just reported in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, were impressive. That doesn't surprise Michelle Genest. She's assistant director of childcare at that Bridgeport Y and calls ECCP phenomenal. Because so many kids there struggle with poverty, hunger, and trauma, Genest says, disruptive behavior is a common challenge.
We've had children attempt to run out of the building, throw furniture. We've had children severely injure other children.
Still, Genest says, suspension never makes sense. And she sees ECCP, which costs just over $2 million a year, as a vital investment in the mental health of Connecticut's most vulnerable kids.
You have to start it now. And if you pump all of your resources in to making productive little people, they are going to grow up to be productive members of society.
Here's how it works. For 3 months, Maria Santos drops in and out of Miss Terry's classroom, offering subtle pointers. The boy with orange socks acts out when he's bored, so give him a front seat at circle time. When he lashes out, it's not anger, but frustration. He's 3, and words don't come easily for him. On this day, after free play, Santos sits with the boy and a little girl at the blocks table. When he snatches a toy from her,
I hurt my feelings.
That hurt your feelings? Can you help us come up with a solution to our problem? You both want to play with that wheel.
With Miss Terry watching, Santos deftly gets the kids building together.
Oh, so now there's a bridge and there's a stop sign at the end of the bridge.
A big part of Santos's job is also building figurative bridges between teachers and parents. In this case, between Miss Terry and the boy's grandmother. The problem is, many pre-K teachers, they don't have the time to do this alone. And they're certainly not paid to do it, often earning less than parking attendants and bellhops. And it's not just teachers who welcome the help.
Caitlin helped me kind of view our daughter Ruby in a new lens.
Annie, a mother in Greenwich, Connecticut, struggled to make sense of her 4-year-old's defiant behavior. With the help of ECCP consultant Caitlin Dunn, she and her husband, Greg, who were also expecting, had several breakthroughs with Ruby, including this one.
She was very nervous about her baby brother coming, and she was afraid that we would love baby brother more than we'd love her.
But being 4, it was hard for Ruby to say that. Instead,
behavior is the language of the child.
That's Liz Bissio, a licensed clinical social worker and director of ECCP. And those may be the 7 most important words in this whole story. So I'm going to play them again.
Behavior is the language of the child.
Not only that, says Bissio, unruly behavior is usually a symptom of something else, often stress, though it can be an early red flag for mental illness. With her consultants, she wants to help teachers and parents get past the symptom to the source. If you don't,
and it's kind of like saying you have a major illness and part of it is a cough and we're going to give you a cough drop.
To be clear, ECCP isn't just focused on disruptive kids. Bissio's 24 consultants spend much of their time working classroom-wide, helping teachers build vital social-emotional skills in all of their students. That can mean teaching kids the turtle technique. If something bad happens, go into your shell, take 3 deep breaths, and think calm thoughts. Or my favorite, setting up a cozy corner. Miss Terry in Bridgeport, she has one. 5-year-old Madison points me to it. A nook in the back wall, padded with pillows and stuffed animals.
If you cry for your mom, then you can go in a corner.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Have you guys ever needed to use the cozy corner?
I wish, because I didn't want to go to school with them one day.
Instead of punishing big feelings, teachers need to respect and help kids manage them. For Miss Terry, that also means
Let's do some meditation. Everybody, eyes are closed. Let's go. Breathe in. Breathe out.
Since ECCP began, it's reached more than 30,000 children. And of the many preschoolers it's helped directly, 98% were still suspension-free 6 months later, which means more kids on Miss Terry's big red rug celebrating their graduation to kindergarten. Corey Turner, NPR News, Bridgeport, Connecticut.
That was a little bit over 7 minutes long, and that ran on Morning Edition nationwide. Can you imagine how much it would have cost for a 7-minute nationwide commercial on early childhood mental health consultation? You know, part of our job, I think, is to think about what kind of supports is it that preschool teachers and child care providers and families and children need, and then when we find them, then the other part of our job is to tell the story so that we can continue providing them and to continue. In Connecticut, it's not hard for us to keep this funded. It's surprising, you know, because Connecticut's in a financial challenge right now, but this program's still going on. In times when other programs get cut, this program remains. And I think a big part of it is that the decision makers love it. It was their idea, they funded it, and they have lots of data that's coming in from around the nation saying that their program is a great thing to be doing for children and families, you know. And so part of our job is not only to do great things, but part of our job is to tell great stories about the great things that we do so we can continue doing them for children and families. We've been also focusing on things having to do with, like, how do you measure mental health in classrooms? How do you measure equity in classrooms? You know, I don't want to go into a whole lot of this because I want to show you something else here in a second, but we're in the middle of a random control trial in Ohio, and part of the things that we're looking at are things like, is it possible that there's certain equitable behaviors that teachers sometimes engage in, that when they engage in those behaviors, you can no longer predict risk of expulsion on the basis of birth factors because it's an equitable enough setting for the child to be in. We have a measure that we've been using that looks at equity issues, and we did a study in Hartford, Connecticut, and found that in Hartford, Connecticut, when teachers engaged in certain kinds of behaviors, like floating around the classroom to make sure that each child gets equitable access to the teacher, and also teachers noticing and responding to children's subtle nonverbal and paraverbal communication. Not just requests for assistance, but also just the look that they might need assistance. Or not what they said, but how they said it, and responding to the how they are interacting. Teachers who are able to do that have children who are dual language learners who learn English at a significantly faster rate. Fascinating, isn't it? We ran that by some colleagues who studied dual language learning in early childhood classrooms, and they said, fascinating, yes. Expected, absolutely. Because if you have a child who's dual language learner in your classroom and the teacher's not paying attention to nonverbal and paraverbal cues, what is that teacher paying attention out of that child? That's all that child's got. You know, so it kind of makes sense, I guess, you know? And so we're thinking that maybe it's time for us to start looking at different types of things in classrooms that don't have to do with how does the lead teacher interact with the majority of the children the majority of the time. Because as long as we're only looking at the lead teacher and how the lead teacher interacts with the majority of the children the majority of the time, we are on purpose avoiding equity. Because equity is not how you interact with the majority of the children. It's about how you interact with each and every child in that classroom. And we need to have measures, I think, that reflect that if we want to be able to have any hope to be able to have more equitable classrooms and more equitable sets of experiences for children and families in those classrooms. I care a lot about children getting excluded and kicked out of preschool classrooms for a variety of different reasons. You know, and here's one of the reasons why I care about it. How many people have heard of the Perry Preschool Study? Or how many people have heard of High Scope? You know, high scope is the curriculum that came from the preschool study. There's 3 studies that we cite, or people like me who talk to decision makers cite over and over again to make the case for why early care and education should exist in the United States. 3 studies that we cite constantly. And the reason why is because these 3 studies are the 3 studies that have cost-benefit analyses attached to them that allow us to say things like every dollar that's spent on early care and education yields $7.14 in societal savings. Or every dollar that's spent on early care and education yields $17 in societal savings. Those all come from mostly 3 studies. The preschool study in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and number 2, the second most widely cited study, the Abecedarian study in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and the number 3 most widely cited study, the Chicago Child Parent Center study. Those are the 3 most widely cited studies in the field, you know, that make us invest in these programs, that we can see this as not just altruistic programs, but also a public investment. You know, but the thing that we oftentimes don't talk about is who were in those studies? Who were the participating children and families in those studies? The number 1 most widely cited study to make the case for why we are even in this room today, the preschool study, was a study of 123 children in Ypsilanti, Michigan, randomly assigned to either go to a high-quality preschool program or no preschool program at all. 123 children in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and every one of the children in the study were African American. Every single child in that study was black. The number 2 most widely cited study in the field of early care and education, the Abecedarian study, 98% black. The number 3 most widely cited study in the field of early care and education, the Chicago Child Parent Center, is 93% black. Those are the number 1, 2, and 3 most widely cited studies for why you should be here today, for why the early childhood field should even exist at all. It's a science that's largely derived from collecting data on our children and families and communities of color to create a program for the benefit of all of our children. And then, when no one's paying attention, we disproportionately kick out the back door the children of color who gave us the data in the first place. That's one of the reasons why I care about this. It happens in medicine all the time, where we go into communities of color that might have fewer resources, and then we solicit their participation in a medical research study, knowing full well that they will be the last to ever benefit from this. It'll go to somebody else first, and then eventually maybe they'll be able to benefit from it. You know, and it's terrible enough in that field. We can't tolerate that in our field. Our field is all based in social justice. We're all about giving children opportunities. I mean, we are a social justice field. Early childhood field is a social justice field that grew out of the social justice movement and grew out of the civil rights movement, grew out of the war on poverty. Head Start began as part of the war on poverty, as something for the community action councils to do that would be beneficial for children and families. You know, so when you think about social justice and civil rights, it's typically matters of access. It's about your ability to be able to get into something. But access isn't just about getting into something. It's about not getting expelled too. Access can mean access to a seat on a bus, or a seat at a deli counter, seat at voting polls, seat at higher education. It can mean getting into an elementary school. But again, access isn't just about getting in. It's also about making sure you're not pushed out the back door once you are in. You know, and that's why I care about children getting expelled from preschool programs, and I hope that you care too. It's become an issue now to the point where many states are doing something about it, including Arizona. You have more early childhood mental health consultation now than you would have had 10 years ago, I think. Many states are looking at ways to ban the practice of it. Just between me and you, banning it will not be enough. You have to provide the supports to the teachers so that they can make a different decision. But the ban can drive teachers towards the supports. Because even if you have a support, it will never be as easy for the teacher to take advantage of that support as it would be to just expel the child in the first place. Unless you make it a little bit more challenging so that they actually will avail themselves of those interventions that are designed to be able to provide those supports and to be able to help children be able to succeed. There's my team. You can see the members of the team, support here from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. I thank you so much for all of your attention. You can follow me on Twitter, where I really cut loose. I got a couple of more minutes, And I wanted to tell you about something right before I got off the stage. Just this last February, my dear mentor, Edward Zigler, passed away. How many people know the name Edward Zigler? Many people know of him as the father of Head Start, but he was also the chair of the baby resettlement effort as part of Operation Baby Lift. You ever hear of Operation Baby Lift? It is the largest mass evacuation of children ever conducted. And it brought over several thousand children at the fall of Saigon into the United States. And it was Dr. Zigler who was contacted when he was on family vacation in Cape Cod, saying that Gerald Ford needed to have him chair the committee on what to do about all of this. In 2015, Head Start was celebrating its 50th birthday. And I didn't know how many years we would have left with my mentor. And so I got Yale to come in with some cameras into his house. And I asked them, when they had the cameras into his house, to just roll the cameras and let me ask him questions. I wanted to ask him questions that no one else would know the answer to other than him, because at that time, he was still the last living member of the Head Start Planning Committee, the last person alive who was in the room when Head Start was being designed. And at this time, Head Start was a program that has served over 36 million children. 36 million American children all around the country who had benefited from a program that he was on the planning committee and designed, and that he ran during the Nixon administration. He actually worked for Richard Nixon running Head Start and child care and child protection services and other things like that. So I wanted to know, like when Head Start says comprehensive services, why? When Head Start says 2 generations, where did that idea come from? When Head Start says that we educate the whole child, where did that come from? Parent involvement, how did all this kind of stuff get in there? And so I asked him to reflect on this. And here's some of the things that he said. I just want you to take a listen to this really quickly because I got an interesting way to summarize this as we all leave here today.
I was a poor child. That's why I became so interested in the Head Start program. I actually had my own Head Start program. My parents were immigrants. English was not my first language. But back in those days, and to this day, there's a phenomenon in this country that we call settlement houses, like the Henry Settlement House in New York City. I went to preschool at the settlement house that I went to. I got my health services there. In many ways, it was like Head Start. Well, anybody that knows child clinical psychology knows that if you're going to work with a child and try to improve his mental health, you had to prove with the parent as well. Head Start doesn't raise children. Parents raise children. So parent involvement was a brand new idea. The thing you have to remember is that before Head Start, there were programs for poor children in this country. But what characterized those programs was they were interested only in education. What Head Start did was it introduced really the whole child approach. What federal program has ever lasted 50 years? I can't think of any but Social Security. So it's had a life of its own. 1 million kids a year go through Head Start, and their parents go through Head Start. It's a lot of children. And it's going to be there. It's going to be there for 50 more years.
You know, it's interesting to think about this. Did you catch what he said? Ed Zigler was raised poor, the son of immigrants who came to the United States. He was the first in his family born in the United States in 1930. His parents, when they first came over here, they didn't speak any English. They spoke Yiddish and Polish. And when they came over, they were poor. And they didn't have any education. And they needed a lot of assistance. When Ed was on the Head Start Planning Committee, one of his jobs was he was tasked with what should Head Start look like? What should the programs be? And Ed, as you just heard, reflected back on what happened to the settlement homes. And the settlement homes were programs, especially in the Kansas City area where he was, were largely programs that were designed to provide supports for our burgeoning immigrant children and families and refugee families. Ed basically said back in 2015 that the thing that he was thinking in his mind when he was asked, what should Head Start look like, is he remembered how we used to treat our immigrant and refugee families in the 1930s. And that is the basis for a program that has now served over 35, 36 million children every year in this country. How he remembered we treated our immigrant children and families in the 1930s. So thank you all so much for your attention. Thank you for bearing with me all this time. And thank you so much for the work that you do on behalf of children and families. My gratitude to you.